I'm light. That answers the question pretty succinctly. The question, which is really the subject of what I'm talking about this week, as we continue our study of Robert Brummett's Birthing a Greater Reality. Last week we were kind of addressing the question, where am I? And we talked about mapping consciousness. And by understanding different maps of consciousness, being able to say, oh, I must be here, and I want to go there. For example, in the spiral dynamics map of consciousness, I might read that and realize, oh, I'm kind of orange and blue. And I'd like to at least get to green, right? So I have an idea of where I am. This week we address one of the other critical questions, if we wish to evolve consciously, because that's what this entire series is about conscious evolution. Not just kind of happenstance, maybe we'll get lucky evolution, but about taking the responsibility for our own evolution in spirit. Right? So it is absolutely vital for us to be able to answer the question, who am I? As I've been pondering this week, I keep hearing a line from the old musical, a chorus line that goes, who am I anyway? Am I my resume? Is that a picture of a person? I don't know. And that's really what we're after, is trying to identify who and what we are. Who am I? If you ask yourself that question right now, who am I? What do you hear? Let's just go within for just a second. Just close your eyes and say, who am I? Who am I? The easy answers are unsatisfying, and the search for the truth can be terrifying. Can't it? Come back if you haven't. See, I can answer that question in a lot of different ways. I could say, well, I'm Charles Perry, and that doesn't really address who I am. There are other guys out there named Charles Perry. Even if I said Reverend Charles Perry, there is actually a Reverend Charles Perry Chapel in the National Cathedral in Washington. So I can kind of remove that from my bucket list. Somebody already did that. Okay? I could say I'm a Unity minister, but there are hundreds of us running around. That's not very specific. I could say I am a CW4 in the Army National Guard in the Field Artillery, and while that is fairly rare, that doesn't really specifically address who I am. All of the ways that we use to identify ourselves tend to miss what we really are. And that kind of comes with the territory. When we meditate, we become aware of the fact that we may be having a thought, right? I mean, how many of you have had that happen to you when you're trying to meditate? It I'm thinking again. It was a thought. Doggone it. I'm supposed to be meditating. That was a thought. Now stop. Right? Okay. So the thought process is not us. Can we take that as a given? Right? We are not our thoughts. We are not even the thinker of our thoughts. That's our mind. We are the observer. But the question is, who is that? In the 3rd chapter of that book, Robert uses a really nice analogy. He says, if you're in a dark room with a flashlight, right, you can shine the flashlight around the room, and eventually you will see all of the contents of the room. except for the flashlight. One of the key points is that our spirit is boundless. Our spirit exists in a place that is beyond time and space. Right? It is not bound by the normal laws of space and time. It exists outside of them. Our mind, however, is bound by time. And so our spirit, our watcher, our consciousness exists in a place the mind cannot see. And that scares the living bejesus out of us. It's like a black hole that we can't look into. So we start making stuff up. You know, if I can't really answer who I am, I'm going to make some stuff up. Right? And I'm going to be real proud of it too. I'm Charles Perry. Nice to meet you. Right? I'm Reverend Charles Perry. I'm the senior minister of Unity Birmingham. That's who I am. Says so right there on my name tag. Meanwhile, we have a place we don't want anyone to look. Right? Especially not us. We don't want to see what's in that unknown empty spot. We don't want to see that flashlight. Because we're afraid of it. We're afraid of the things that we can't see and don't know. So we build this personality up because we're comfortable with that. We can live with that. And at the same time, we're afraid of it because we're afraid somebody might find out who we really are before we do, which would be really bad. Right? But the thing is that thing that we build up doesn't really catch that essential nature of who we are. It doesn't understand that it is light. That's not enough. We have to make up something more, something different, something special, something unique. We have to separate ourselves. And that is one of the places where our problem begins, because our pain lies in our separation. And yet that is one of the defining features of the ego, is that it is separate from the one. You know, it's our belief in that ego and its separateness which is the source of all of our suffering as human beings. Every bit of it. So then what we have to ask ourselves is, well, how are we going to get back? Right? How do we stop this thing? How do we remake ourselves? So one thing that Robert says about that false self that I think is really important to remember is it's not permanent. It's not set in stone. Your ego is not some entity that has a life of its own that you can't do anything about. You know, it may do your therapist a whole world of good to have you come back for several years and say, well, you know, that's the way you were formed, you know, it's your mom and your dad, and you know, that's your ego, and we'll work on that in your next session. But the truth is your ego is not something made out of concrete or granite, all right? As Robert says, the false self is a process. It is something that we are creating virtually every moment. This false self is a pattern of repetitive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It can exist only as this pattern is consistently reinforced. It has no independent existence. To become free, We need to recognize this pattern and see when and how we continue to reinforce it, and then stop reinforcing it. All right? It's interesting how these things that we teach, we kind of keep teaching the same thing over and over again. We just keep trying to come at it from a different angle. So, how many of you were here when we went through the keys to the kingdom? That's a pretty good bunch of you. All right? I know. I'm going to ask that question again, right? Yeah. Does anybody remember any of them? Right? All right. So, the third key to the kingdom. Probably none of you know what that is, right? Okay. The third one. Yeah, it's number 3, right? Yes. Okay. Nothing gets past. He's a razor sharp guy, you know. Yeah. Thank you, Taylor. Well, yeah. If you had the book, I actually do happen to have the book right here, right? The third key to the kingdom is building a new awareness. Now, interestingly enough, there is a section in building a new awareness where David Owen Ritz, who wrote Keys to the Kingdom, talks about how a belief system ends up working. So you start out with a belief system. What happens is that your beliefs then give rise to your thoughts. Your thoughts give rise to your feelings and emotions. From that comes your speech, followed by your actions. And that is how your reality is created. It begins with your beliefs. So just as Robert talks about our egoic beliefs and the fact that they are in fact malleable, that we do have the ability to change them, I'm going to go back to an idea that David taught us. And here's the good news. You don't have to know what your entire belief system is in order to change it. Okay? It's helpful to do some kind of a personal inventory. You know, for example, those of us who have been through recovery knows that the 4th step is extremely powerful. Right? That's where we kind of lay out on paper all of our resentments and, you know, all of maybe the good things about us as well. We do a complete inventory. And then we distill all that down into essentially the things that we are the most afraid of. And that is powerful news indeed. Again, to tell on myself, you know, when I did that, and I discovered that, you know, 2 of my greatest fears had to do with self-esteem and my issues with women, which I kind of talked about, you know, I think was it last week? I told the story about my mother, you know, turning me away when I was a baby. Wow, is that powerful? You know, because it helped me decide what are my things to do this lifetime. What cycles are mine to break in this lifetime? You know, and for me, for the men in my family, I know that one of the things that's mine to do is to break the cycle of addiction. You know, not in actually both sides of my family and not just men. But not just, you know, say alcohol, for example, but the whole 9 yards, which is why I've given up caffeine. And I'm working on sugar. And, you know, whatever else I can figure out that I'm using as some external means of dealing with whatever perceived pain I feel, instead of going inside and realizing I'm light. Because that always works, always, when I do that. You know? When I really spend time with God, when I really go deep within, when I really reach out and feel that connection, all the rest of it's just stuff. Doesn't matter. But I want to stop that cycle in my generation. right? The way my grandfather and my father treated women, I want to stop that. I'm doing better. So far, I've only been married 3 times. My dad was married 5. It's progress, not perfection, right? But I had to go in and know that. I had to do a little personal inventory work to figure out, who am I? And when I could stand up and in public say, my name's Charles and I'm an alcoholic, that got me started down the path, right? But there are a lot more ways that I have to look at who I really am. And I can change who I am by changing my beliefs. So what David said that's really very important to us is that simply by replacing erroneous beliefs with truth, we can start pulling our belief system in the direction of better. Again, it may be progress, not perfection, right? But if I can just get one simple truth, like, there is nothing and no one against me, right? We've made that the theme of this year here, that there is nothing and no one against us. Reverend Christine's going to come back and do one more Q Effect workshop next month. And I think Ashley's got a sign-up sheet out there for it if you're interested in doing that. It is absolutely brilliant work. For those folks who have been through it, I think any of them will attest to it. It can be life-changing because one of the things that it does is it really lets us know who we are, what our stuff is, what's going on in that shadow, so that we can say, okay, well, if that's where I really am, this is the way I want to go. This is what I want to let go of. This is what I want to put down in order to live in that clear, clean, pure energy, in that light that I really, truly am. I have to be willing to let that go. One of the important things for all of us to do is, as we begin to do this work, as we uncover new truths, like there is nothing and no one against me, the universe is an abundant place, not a place filled with lack. As we begin living from those, is not to beat ourselves up about where we came from. It's not your fault. You remember that scene in Good Will Hunting when Robin Williams kept saying to Matt Damon over and over again, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And when, Matt's character finally begins to realize he's telling the truth, he starts to cry. It's not your fault. One other thing that Robert says about how we came by this, how we came by our belief systems. He says it's most likely our parents were imperfect human beings. You think? Loved them. Love you, Mom. Love you, Dad. But yeah. Who lived ignorant of their own essential nature. That means they didn't know they were light. They didn't know that. And that wasn't their fault either. They were probably identified with their personality. Boy, howdy, were they. As such, they were most likely wounded by their past, and carried unhealed wounds within their own psyche. Yeah. They too lived in a culture that did not support their essential nature. Ours doesn't. Our parents could not give us what they did not have, and they could not help but pass some of their own wounding on to us. Even the most well-meaning parents cannot give their children the essential support they are unable to experience within themselves. It's pretty simple, but it's profound. The effect our parents had on us, the effect we as parents have had on our children. I thank God my kids still talk to me, after kind of the way I was when they were small. We have a very good relationship today. But boy, and it took some time for me to heal my relationship with my father. He was one of my best friends before he died, and I'm very grateful for that. And yet here I stand, imperfect, partially because I'm a lot like my dad. And I know that, So I work on that every day. Every day. Before I get out of bed in the morning, I pray and I set an intention. And some of those intentions are simple things that carry me a little further down the path. Sometimes I stay in there a little longer than I should, probably. It's like, okay, God, my feet are about to hit the floor. let's do this. But it takes that awareness of who I really am. But so much of that personality that we are working against comes from, all of it really comes from the outside. We think that we have a unique personality, but the truth is, most of our personalities came from our parents, people around us, our teachers, our popular culture. The mask that we wear is an amalgam of all the things that we learned to get us through the day and get our needs met. Robert talks about how children are socialized, and rather than simply being able to continue living from their essential nature, they realize that in order to get their basic needs met, and for a child, basic needs include things like a little self-esteem and genuine connection and a sense of safety, which a lot of children don't have, right? They have to come up with something. They have to behave some way that is not necessarily who they are to get what they want, to get what they need. And they just learn that as a coping mechanism, and that coping mechanism becomes the basis of their personality. I have permission to tell this story specifically. A couple of weeks ago, I was on vacation, and I was at a reunion of people that I went to college with. And one of the guys has been this past year mourning his wife, who died unexpectedly. They had been separated for quite a long time. She was actually had a long-term relationship with someone else, but they had never gotten around to getting married. And they had 3 beautiful children. But I had to say to him when I saw him for the first time in 33 years, I'm confused. I always thought you were gay. And he said, well, I am. What happened was back in 1985, if those of you who can remember 1985, back in 1985, many of our friends were dying. It was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And back then, if you had AIDS, you died quickly because they didn't have anything to help you with. They didn't know what they were up against. And several of our close friends from college had died. And he got scared. And like a lot of folks back then, he was looking for any answer that he could come up with. So he thought, well, maybe I could get over this being gay thing. Maybe God will help me. And so he asked a friend that we'd gone to school with if he could go to church with her. And his lover, who was another guy we went to school with, said, can I go too? So they basically went and got saved and stopped being lovers. Well, the friend that he went to church with that time was a woman, and she finally, after some time, admitted to him that she was in love with him. He's like, well, I love you too. And she said, no, you don't get it. I love you. I'm in love with you. And he thought, well, maybe this is it. Maybe this is God, answering my prayer. So they got married. He became an evangelical minister. They had 3 children. he does a one-man show about it. It's funny when he talks about his wedding night. He sings the song, "Pardon me, miss, but I've never done this with a real live girl." It's pretty funny. Yeah. But what happened to him is what eventually happens to a lot of us who attempt to paste over our essential natures and our shadows. He started drinking. And he drank a lot. And then his true nature kind of started asserting itself, and he began acting out and not being faithful. And finally, his family had to do an intervention, and his wife said, "How are you going to tell our kids if you don't fix this?" And the only way for him to fix it was to leave behind his evangelical religion and to admit to his kids who he was and begin living from who he really is. Our egos want to shove a lot of stuff into the shadow. When we talk about the shadow in unity, it's important to understand that not everything in there is bad. We shoved it in there because we thought we had to survive. I was always a more emotional boy. My mother's family was a very emotional bunch. My dad used to say that they would kiss each other goodbye to go to the bathroom. But being the son of a, entrepreneur, lieutenant colonel in the early 1960s, that was not what was going to feed my survival strategy. And so I had to shove a lot of my emotional life into my shadow. And I'm still working on letting some of it out. I've done all right. But that's a process. But that emotional kid was not bad. I wasn't wrong. So we may all find that we have thrown things into the shadow because we thought we needed them to survive. We thought we needed to be whatever this other thing was, whatever that mask we had to put on was. We thought we had to be that. We couldn't just be who we are because we can't see how that's safe. We don't understand. We are light. Whoever you truly are is enough. Whoever you truly are is perfect. Because whoever you truly are is a beloved child of God. When we can all remember that, we have a very good chance of moving our collective conscious evolution in a direction that will not only save us as a species, but allow us all to eventually make it to that oneness that we know in truth we are. I am light. Say that with me one time. I am light, so you are.